The messenger's horse died 3 miles from the Spartan camp. The animal simply stopped, legs folding beneath it like a puppet with cut strings, foam crusting its muzzle. Heart burst from the desperate ride south. The messenger, an Argive herald, technically protected by divine law, stumbled the remaining distance on foot, clutching a leather scroll case that contained either peace or annihilation. The year was 546 BC. The war had been going for longer than anyone could remember. Not this specific war. There had been dozens of those, formal declarations and formal surrenders, treaties signed and treaties shattered. The war, the eternal bleeding contest between Sparta and Argos over a strip of coastal plain called Thyreatis. Grandfathers had died fighting for these fields. Their grandfathers had died before them. The graveyards on both sides had grown so large that the living had begun building houses on top of them, because the dead were taking up too much of the land that the living kept killing each other to possess. The Spartan ephors received the Argive herald in the usual manner, standing armed, expressions carved from the same stone as their city's walls. They did not offer him water, though he was clearly dying of thirst. They did not offer him a seat, though his legs trembled from exhaustion. They simply waited, 5 old men with the power to commit 20,000 soldiers to slaughter, watching a foreign messenger try to remember how to breathe. The proposal he carried was unprecedented. It was also, in its own horrible way, elegant. Argos was tired. Sparta was tired. Both cities had been hemorrhaging men and money into Thyreatis for half a century, and neither had achieved anything except the manufacture of orphans. The Argive assembly, in a moment of either brilliance or desperation, had voted to offer Sparta a different kind of resolution: no more armies, no more campaigns. No more years of maneuvering and sieging and starving. Instead, champions, 300 from each side. They would meet on the disputed plain, and they would fight until one side had no men left standing. The survivors, if there were any, would claim Thyreatis for their city forever. Both main armies would withdraw beyond the horizon. No reinforcement, no interference, no possibility of anything except total commitment to total violence. The Spartan ephors listened to the proposal without expression. When the herald finished speaking, the eldest ephor, a man named Chilon, whose own son had died in the last Thyreatis campaign, asked a single question. "And if we refuse?" The herald swallowed. "Then the war continues, as it has continued, as it will continue until one city or the other ceases to exist." Chilon looked at his fellow ephors. No words were exchanged. None were necessary. These men had spent their lives calculating the mathematics of Spartan survival, and the mathematics of the current war were catastrophic. Sparta could win battles. Sparta always won battles. But winning battles was not winning wars, and the war with Argos was bleeding the city white. Every campaign season meant another 500 Spartiates marching north. Every campaign season meant another 200 coming back in the carts reserved for the dead. At this rate, within 3 generations, there would not be enough Spartan men to fill a phalanx. 300 men, one afternoon, a permanent resolution. The mathematics were brutal, but they were also beautiful. 300 was a price Sparta could pay. 300 was a sacrifice that might actually purchase something, rather than the endless installment payments of the current war. Chilon nodded. "We accept." The herald blinked. He had expected negotiation, counter-proposals, the elaborate diplomatic theater that typically preceded any agreement between Greek states. The immediate acceptance unsettled him in ways he couldn't articulate. "You accept? Without conditions?" "One condition." Chilon's voice was flat, empty of emotion. "The battle takes place in 30 days. Both sides will need time to select their champions." 30 days. The herald nodded, already calculating the ride back to Argos. "The assembly will ratify the agreement. We will meet on the plain of Thyreatis at the new moon." "At the new moon," Chilon agreed. "And herald?" "Yes. Tell your assembly something for me. Tell them that Sparta thanks Argos for this proposal. We have been waiting 50 years for a chance to settle this matter properly. We are grateful that Argos has finally found the courage to give us one." The herald left with those words ringing in his ears. He did not understand them. He would not understand them until 30 days later, when he stood on a hillside watching 600 men convert a wheat field into an abattoir. The Spartans understood something that the Argives did not, something that made the proposal not just acceptable but actively desirable. In an open battle between armies, anything could happen. Cavalry could flank, supply lines could fail, allies could betray. The chaos of large-scale warfare introduced variables that even Spartan discipline could not fully control. But 300 against 300 on a defined field with no possibility of retreat or reinforcement? That was not war. That was a controlled experiment in violence, and the Spartans had spent 3 centuries perfecting the science. The Ephors began the selection process that same evening. They did not ask for volunteers. They did not need to. Every Spartiate in the city understood what had just been agreed, and every Spartiate in the city was already preparing to be chosen. In the barracks, men sharpened swords that were already sharp. In the mess halls, conversations fell silent as soldiers contemplated the mathematics of their own mortality. In the homes of the married, wives looked at husbands and understood that the next 30 days might be all the time they had left. 300 men would be selected. Perhaps 50 would survive, perhaps none. The contract had been signed, the blood price had been set. Now all that remained was the payment. To understand why 600 men agreed to die for the Thermopylae plain, you must first understand what the Thermopylae plain actually was. Not symbolically, sina. The Greeks had plenty of symbolic reasons to kill each other, practically, economically, calorically. The Thermopylae was a coastal strip approximately 20 miles long and 8 miles wide, wedged between the Parnon mountain range and the Argolic Gulf. It was not beautiful. It was not strategically positioned to control trade routes or mountain passes. It had no gold deposits, no silver mines, no marble quarries. By the standards of territorial disputes that would later convulse the Greek world, it was almost comically insignificant. It was also the most valuable agricultural land in the eastern Peloponnese. The soil of Thyreatis was what agronomists called deep alluvial loam, centuries of river sediment deposited in layers that held moisture, retained nutrients, and produced grain yields that made farmers weep with joy. A single acre of Thyreatis farmland could feed 3 families. The same acre in the rocky hills of Laconia might feed half a family in a good year if the rains came at the right time. Sparta's fundamental problem was that Sparta could not feed itself. The Eurotas Valley produced enough barley and wheat to sustain perhaps 15,000 people. Sparta's population, including the massive Helot slave class that worked the fields, exceeded 60,000. The mathematics of this deficit had shaped Spartan society from its inception. The Helots existed because Sparta needed slaves to farm every available inch of arable land. The Spartiate warrior class existed because Sparta needed soldiers to control the Helots and to conquer new farmland when the existing supply proved insufficient. The entire brutal machinery of the Spartan state, the Agoge, the mess halls, the iron discipline, was ultimately a response to a single geographic fact: there was not enough food. Thyreatis could change that equation. 20 miles of prime agricultural land, properly farmed, could feed an additional 10,000 people. It could provide the surplus that would allow Sparta to expand its citizen class, to fund larger armies, to become something more than a perpetually hungry city-state surrounded by enemies. Argos understood this mathematics as well as Sparta did, which is why Argos had been fighting for Thyreatis with equal desperation. The Argive plain was fertile, but the Argive population was growing, and the difference between prosperity and famine was measured in acres of wheat. But the geographic value of Thyreatis was only part of the equation. The deeper issue, the reason the war had continued for 50 years despite the exhaustion of both sides, was psychological. Sparta and Argos were not merely rivals. They were definitional opposites, each city understanding itself primarily in contrast to the other. Argos was old Greece, cultured, artistic, proud of its Homeric heritage, claiming descent from the heroes who had sailed to Troy. Sparta was new Greece, austere, militaristic, contemptuous of the soft traditions that Argos cherished. To lose Thyreatis was not merely to lose farmland. It was to lose an argument about what Greece should be. The Argives told themselves that they were fighting to preserve civilization against Spartan barbarism. The Spartans told themselves that they were fighting to prove that discipline conquered decadence. Both sides had invested so much blood in these narratives that retreat had become psychologically impossible. This is why the proposal for champion combat found acceptance in both cities, not because it was rational. 600 deaths would not resolve the underlying tensions any more than 6,000 had, but because it offered something that 50 years of conventional warfare had failed to provide: a definitive answer. One side would win, one side would lose. The gods themselves would render judgment through the medium of bronze and blood. Whatever the outcome, it would be final. The endless argument would receive an ending. The location selected for the battle was a wheat field approximately 2 miles south of the main Argive camp. The field had been harvested 3 weeks earlier, leaving stubble that crunched underfoot and soil packed hard by the summer sun. It was flat, open, and approximately 400 yards square, large enough for 600 men to maneuver, small enough that there was nowhere to hide. The boundaries were marked with white stones placed at 50-yard intervals. Any combatant who crossed the boundary would be considered to have forfeited, his city's claim diminished by his cowardice. The stakes, wooden posts driven into the ground at the north and south ends of the field, marked the positions where each side would begin. There would be no cavalry, no archers, no support troops of any kind. Just 300 men on each side, armed with the standard panoply of the Greek hoplite: bronze helmet, bronze cuirass, bronze greaves, round hoplon shield, 8-foot dory spear, and short cyphus sword for the close work that would follow when the spears shattered. The wheat field had produced perhaps 600 bushels of grain that summer. By the time the battle was over, it would be fertilized with 600 corpses. The mathematics of agriculture and the mathematics of slaughter had always been intertwined in the Greek world. Thyriatus simply made the connection explicit. The land was worth dying for because the land was life itself. Without it, cities starved. With it, cities prospered. The 600 men who agreed to fight understood this calculation at a level deeper than conscious thought. They were not dying for abstract principles or political disputes. They were dying for bread. The Spartan ephors did not ask for volunteers. This was not because volunteers would not have stepped forward. Every Spartiate in the city would have volunteered, and the ephors knew it. The problem was that volunteers are motivated by emotion, glory-seeking, death-wishing, the desperate need to prove something to themselves or others. Emotion was unreliable. Emotion got men killed at the wrong moment for the wrong reasons. The ephors wanted 300 men who would kill efficiently and die productively. They wanted components, not heroes. The selection criteria were established within hours of the Argive herald's departure. Age between 25 and 40, old enough to have experience, young enough to have stamina. Physical condition, no injuries from previous campaigns that might limit mobility. Mental condition, stable, controlled, capable of maintaining discipline under pressure that would shatter ordinary men. Family status, unmarried or married with at least 2 surviving sons. This last criterion was the coldest calculation of all. The ephors were not sending 300 men to die. They were sending 300 men who might die, and they needed to ensure that those deaths did not create cascading demographic problems. A Spartiate who died without heirs was a Spartiate whose bloodline ended. 300 such deaths would be a catastrophe exceeding the battle itself. But a Spartiate who died leaving 2 sons behind, that was acceptable, that was sustainable. That was the mathematics of managed attrition. The lists were compiled over 3 days. The ephors reviewed the service records of every eligible man, cross-referenced with the reports of the Irenes who supervised training, cross-referenced again with the assessments of the Locos commanders who led them in battle. Each candidate was evaluated on 17 different criteria, scored on a scale of 1 to 5, and the 300 highest scores were selected. There was no ceremony, no announcement. The selected men were simply informed by their messmates that they had been chosen, and they were expected to report to the training grounds at dawn the following morning for specialized preparation. The preparation lasted 26 days. The Spartans did not train their champions to fight as individuals. Individual combat was for Homeric heroes, for the old songs that children heard before they were old enough to understand that war was not singing. The 300 would fight as a unit, a compressed phalanx, 8 ranks deep, designed to grind through the Argive formation with the same mechanical precision that Spartan phalanxes had been grinding through enemies for a century. But there was a difference. In a normal battle, the phalanx could rotate fresh troops to the front, could receive reinforcement from reserves, could withdraw and reform if the pressure became overwhelming. At Thyriatus, there would be no reserves, no rotation, no withdrawal. The 300 would fight until they won or until they were dead. This required modifications to standard doctrine. The front 4 ranks were composed of the largest, strongest men, the shock troops who would absorb the initial Argive charge and deliver the first killing strokes. The rear 4 ranks were composed of the most enduring men, soldiers whose stamina had been tested in grueling training exercises and found inexhaustible. The theory was simple. The front ranks would die first, and as they fell, the rear ranks would step forward into their places, maintaining the formation's integrity even as its personnel were consumed. They drilled the transition endlessly. A whistle blast meant the front rank had been destroyed. The second rank would step forward without missing a beat, shields locking into the gaps, spears leveling at the precise angle required to maintain killing pressure. Another whistle. The third rank moved up. Another. The fourth. By the 15th day of training, the 300 could execute a complete front rank replacement in under 3 seconds. By the 20th day, they could do it while wounded, while exhausted, while individual soldiers were being pulled from the formation by simulated enemy attacks. The psychological preparation was equally systematic. The Spartans understood that even the most disciplined soldier might break when confronted with certain death, and they addressed this possibility with characteristic directness. They made certain death familiar. Each day of training ended with a ritual. The 300 would gather in the evening, and one of the E4 would read aloud the names of Spartans who had died in previous battles, not heroes, ordinary soldiers, men who had held their positions and been overwhelmed, men who had fought until their bodies failed, men who had been forgotten by everyone except the archives. The message was clear. Death was not special. Death was not romantic. Death was simply the final duty of a Spartan soldier, to be performed with the same competence as any other duty. The men who died at Thyreatis would not be remembered as individuals. They would be remembered as a number, 300 Spartans who fulfilled their function. On the final night before departure, the selected men ate their last meal in Sparta. The black broth was the same as always: pork blood, vinegar, salt. The bread was the same. The portions were the same. There was no special treatment for men who would likely be dead within 48 hours. After the meal, they were permitted to visit their families. Some spent the night with wives, knowing these were the last hours they would have. Others visited aging parents, speaking the formal words of farewell that Spartan custom prescribed. A few, the youngest, the ones with no families of their own, simply sat in the barracks and cleaned their equipment over and over because there was nothing else to do. At dawn, they marched north. They did not sing. They did not speak. They moved in the silence of men who had already accepted what was coming, and their silence was more frightening than any war cry. The document was written on goatskin, in the formal legal Greek that both cities used for treaties and contracts. It was witnessed by priests from 3 neutral city-states, Corinth, Sicyon, and Epidaurus, and copies were deposited in the temples of Zeus at Olympia and Apollo at Delphi. By the standards of the 6th century BC, it was as binding as any agreement could be. The terms were simple, perhaps too simple. Article 1. Each city would select 300 champions from among its citizens. The champions must be freeborn, of military age, and equipped according to standard hoplite practice. No mercenaries, no slaves, no allies from other cities. Article 2. The champions would meet on the plain of Thyreatis at the new moon following the agreement's ratification. The precise location would be determined by lot, with both sides submitting 3 proposed sites and a neutral priest drawing the selection. Article 3. Both main armies would withdraw to a distance of no less than 10 miles from the battlefield before combat commenced. Neither army would approach the battlefield until sunset of the battle day, at which point both would advance to witness the outcome. Article 4. Combat would continue until one side had no champions capable of fighting. A champion was considered incapable of fighting if he was dead, unconscious, or had physically left the defined battlefield. Surrender would not be accepted. Article 5. The city whose champions prevailed would hold sovereignty over Thyreatis in perpetuity. The losing city would renounce all claims and would swear sacred oaths never to contest the territory again. Article 6. Any violation of the above terms would invoke the wrath of Zeus Horkios, protector of oaths, and would render the violating city liable to divine punishment and the united retribution of all Greek states. The contract seemed comprehensive. It was not. The Argives and Spartans had been so focused on the mechanics of the battle itself that they had neglected to define the most important term of all: what did it mean to prevail? Did prevailing mean having survivors? If so, what if both sides had survivors? Did prevailing mean killing more enemies? If so, who would count the bodies? Did prevailing mean holding the field? If so, for how long? These ambiguities would prove catastrophic. But on the day the contract was signed, both sides were too exhausted by 50 years of war to imagine that anything could go wrong with such a straightforward arrangement. 300 would fight, one side would win, the matter would be settled. The priests who witnessed the signing performed the standard rituals. A bull was sacrificed, its blood collected in bronze vessels and poured over the document. Both parties swore by Zeus, by Apollo, by Ares, and by the spirits of their dead ancestors. They invoked curses upon themselves and their descendants if they should violate the terms. Then the Spartan delegation and the Argive delegation turned their backs on each other and walked away. They would not speak again until the battlefield was soaked with the blood of their champions. The contract was archived in the temples as promised. Centuries later, historians would retrieve the copies and marvel at how much destruction could flow from so few words. The Battle of the Champions would be remembered not for what the contract specified, but for what it failed to specify: the gap between legal language and human reality that would transform a negotiated resolution into the spark for even greater war, but that was the future. On the day of signing, both cities believed they had found a solution. They had agreed to trade 600 lives for peace, and at the time the exchange seemed reasonable. The new moon was 23 days away. The Spartans arrived at the battlefield 3 hours before dawn. They came in silence, 600 feet moving through the darkness with the synchronized precision of men who had spent their lives learning to move as one. No torches, no commands, just the soft crunch of sandals on harvested stubble and the occasional clink of bronze against bronze when a shield shifted against a cuirass. The Argives were already there. This was not expected. The contract specified that both sides would take position at dawn, but the Argives had apparently decided to claim the psychological advantage of arrival. They stood in formation at the northern end of the field, 300 shadows against the pre-dawn gray, watching the Spartans emerge from the darkness with the fixed attention of men who knew they were looking at their killers. Neither side spoke. Neither side moved. For perhaps 20 minutes, 600 men stood in the darkness, breathing the same air, smelling the same wheat stubble and distant sea salt, waiting for the sun to rise and the dying to begin. The first light broke over the Parnon Mountains at approximately 6 hours after midnight. It came slowly, a gradual bleaching of the eastern sky from black to gray to pale gold, and as it came, the battlefield revealed itself in stages. The field was smaller than either side had imagined. 400 yards square had seemed enormous on the surveyor's maps, but standing on the actual ground, surrounded by white boundary stones, 600 men realized they would be fighting in a space barely larger than a modest farm. There would be no maneuvering, no flanking, no tactical cleverness of any kind, just two walls of bronze crashing together until one wall ceased to exist. The harvested wheat left stubble perhaps 4 inches high, stiff and sharp enough to scratch unprotected ankles. The soil beneath was hard-packed from the summer drought, good footing for the initial charge, but likely to become treacherous once it was soaked with blood. At the center of the field, a slight depression marked where rainwater collected during winter storms, a detail that would become significant as the day progressed. The Argives had formed their phalanx in the traditional manner, 8 ranks deep, shields locked, spears projecting over the shield wall like the quills of a bronze porcupine. Their commander, a man named Alcanor, stood at the center of the front rank, his position marked by the transverse crest on his helmet. He was 42 years old, a veteran of a dozen campaigns, and he had volunteered for this battle because his 3 sons had already died in the Thyreatis Wars and he had nothing left to lose. The Spartans mirrored the Argive formation with minor variations. Their ranks were slightly more compressed, shields overlapping by an additional 2 inches, creating a denser wall at the cost of individual mobility. Their commander was not at the center but at the right wing, the position of honor in Spartan doctrine, the place where the fighting would be most intense because each man's unshielded side was exposed to the enemy. His name was Othryades. He was 37 years old. He had been married for 12 years to a woman named Agiatis, and they had 4 children, 2 of whom were sons old enough to inherit his property. He had been selected for this battle not because he was the best fighter in Sparta. There were perhaps 50 men who could match him in single combat, but because he was the most reliable. In 17 years of service, he had never broken formation. He had never retreated without orders. He had never failed to execute a command exactly as given. The E4s had selected him to lead because they knew he would hold the line until the line no longer existed, and then he would hold it anyway. The priests who would officiate the battle's commencement arrived as the sun cleared the mountains. There were 3 of them, 1 from each neutral city, and they walked to the center of the field with the careful steps of men who understood they were standing on ground that would soon be sacred with blood. The chief priest, a man from Corinth named Timoleon, raised his staff. Both phalanxes fell silent, not that either had been making noise, but somehow the silence deepened, became more absolute, became the silence of men who had stopped breathing. "Champions of Argos," Timoleon called, his voice carrying across the field with the practice projection of a man accustomed to addressing crowds. "Champions of Sparta, you have come to this place to settle by blood a dispute that blood has failed to settle. You have agreed to fight until one side is destroyed. You have sworn oaths that bind your souls to this field. Do both sides confirm their readiness?" "Argos confirms." Alcinor's voice was steady. "Sparta confirms." Athriates' voice was quieter, but it carried. "Then let the gods witness what men do here today." Timoleon lowered his staff. "Begin." The priest had barely finished speaking when the Spartans charged. The collision was audible from 3 miles away. Shepherds tending flocks in the Parnon foothills would later describe it as a sound like nothing they had heard before, a single massive crash, as if 2 mountains had slammed together, followed by a grinding roar that continued without pause for hours. The physics of the initial impact were catastrophic for both sides. 600 men, each weighing approximately 180 pounds plus 60 pounds of equipment, running at full sprint, met at a combined velocity of roughly 24 feet per second. The kinetic energy released at the point of contact was sufficient to kill men who were never touched by weapons. Soldiers in the front ranks on both sides were crushed by the sheer pressure of bodies. Behind them, ribs shattering, lungs collapsing, lives ending before spears could be brought to bear. The first 30 seconds of battle claimed approximately 40 men from each side, not killed by skill or courage, but by mathematics, the simple calculation of mass times velocity that neither army could control once the charge began. Then the real killing started. The Spartan formation had been drilled to maintain cohesion even in the chaos of impact, and this training proved decisive in the opening minutes. While the Argive line buckled and reformed, the Spartans kept pressure constant, shields grinding forward, spears thrusting in the coordinated rhythm they had practiced for weeks. Thrust, step, step. Each motion synchronized across 300 men, creating a single organism of bronze and flesh that the Argive line could not resist. The Argives fell back, not in rout, they were too disciplined for that, but in a controlled retreat designed to create space to relieve the crushing pressure of the Spartan advance. They gave ground in steps, each step costing them men, each man's death buying seconds for his comrades to reorganize. By the end of the first hour, approximately 100 men were dead on each side. The Spartan advantage in coordination had been real, but not decisive. The Argives had matched Spartan discipline with Argive endurance, absorbing the initial onslaught and converting the battle from a shock engagement to a grinding attritional struggle. This was the phase the Greeks called the press, the endless pushing contest where formations locked together and individual combat became almost impossible. Men in the front ranks could not swing their weapons, they could only thrust short, sharp jabs at any exposed flesh within reach. Men in the rear ranks could not see their enemies, they could only push, adding their weight to the mass that drove the front ranks forward. Deaths in the press came slowly, almost randomly. A spear would find a gap in a helmet and a man would drop. The ranks behind would step over his body and continue pushing. A shield would slip, exposing a throat, and a blade would open it. The blood would spray, the body would fall, and the press would continue as if nothing had happened. The heat became a factor by the second hour. The August sun turned bronze armor into furnaces, and men who had been fighting since dawn began to cook inside their own equipment. Sweat soaked the padding beneath cuirasses, creating friction burns that added to the agony of combat. Lips cracked, tongues swelled. The air inside helmets became a humid hell that made every breath a labor. Men began dying of heat exhaustion. They would simply stop moving, their bodies overwhelmed by temperature that no amount of training could overcome. Their comrades would push them aside, step over them, keep fighting. There was no time for mercy, no space for compassion. The press demanded forward motion, and anything that impeded forward motion was an obstacle to be overcome. By the third hour, both formations had lost cohesion. The neat ranks of the morning had dissolved into a chaotic scrum of individual combats, small groups of men fighting back-to-back against enemies who came from every direction. This should have favored the Argives, whose training emphasized individual skill over collective discipline. Instead, it exposed a critical Spartan advantage: stamina. The Spartans had been training for this battle for 26 days. The Argives had been training for war in general, not for the specific demands of a 6-hour continuous engagement. As the battle entered its 4th hour, Argive soldiers began to slow. Their thrusts came a fraction of a second later. Their parries were a fraction of an inch too shallow. In the calculus of close combat, fractions were death sentences. The body count accelerated: 40 Argive deaths in the 4th hour, 50 in the 5th. The Spartans were dying too, but at a lower rate, perhaps 30 per hour, and the differential was compounding. By late afternoon, the Spartans had perhaps 80 men still fighting. The Argives had fewer than 50. The end seemed inevitable. The Spartans would grind the Argives down to nothing, claim victory, and limp home with perhaps 30 or 40 survivors. The mathematics favored Sparta, as the mathematics of attrition always had. And then the Argives did something unexpected. Alcinor, the Argive commander, was still alive. He had fought his way through 6 hours of hell, taken wounds to his arms, his legs, his face, and he had kept fighting because stopping meant dying and dying meant losing. But as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, he looked at what remained of his force and made a calculation. If the battle continued, the Argives would lose, the Spartans would win, Thyriatis would become Spartan territory, and the 50 years of Argive sacrifice would mean nothing. But the contract had not specified how victory would be determined. It had specified only that combat would continue until one side had no champions capable of fighting. Alcinor was capable of fighting. So was his lieutenant, a man named Chromios, and perhaps a dozen others scattered across the field, still standing, still holding weapons. The contract had not specified that winners must remain on the field. Alcinor gathered his survivors. He signaled a retreat, not from the battle, but from the battlefield itself. They would withdraw, report to the main Argive army, and claim victory on the grounds that they had surviving champions while the Spartans did not. It was a technicality. It was a manipulation of legal language that violated the spirit of the agreement while obeying its letter. It was also, Alcinor believed, the only way to save what remained of Argive honor. The Argive survivors began to withdraw toward the boundary stones, and behind them, buried under a pile of corpses, a Spartan who should have been dead opened his eyes. Othryades had been stabbed 7 times. The first wound, early in the battle, had opened a gash across his left thigh that bled freely until the blood coagulated into a sticky mass that glued his leg to his greave. The second wound had punctured his right shoulder, limiting his spear arm to short, jabbing motions rather than the full thrust his training demanded. The third, fourth, and fifth wounds were shallow, cuts across his forearms from blades he had blocked imperfectly, injuries that would have ended a normal man's fighting, but that a Spartan was trained to ignore. The sixth wound had dropped him. An Argive spear had found the gap between his cuirass and his helmet, entering the soft tissue of his neck at an angle that somehow missed the major blood vessels. The impact knocked him backward, and the press of bodies pushed him down, and within seconds he was buried under the dead, bleeding into the dirt, vision narrowing to a gray tunnel as his body began the process of dying. He should have died. By any reasonable medical standard, he was dying. Blood loss, shock, and the pressure of corpses compressing his chest combined to create conditions incompatible with survival. But Othryades was not operating on reasonable medical standards. He was operating on 23 years of Spartan conditioning, and that conditioning contained no provision for giving up. The seventh wound came as he lay in the pile of bodies. A dying Argive, thrashing in his own death agony, drove a broken spear shaft into Othryades' abdomen. It was not deep, perhaps 2 inches of splintered ash penetrating the muscle wall, but it was enough to send fresh waves of pain through a nervous system already saturated with trauma. The pain woke him up, not fully. Full consciousness was beyond his damaged body's capabilities, but enough to hear the sounds of battle changing, enough to hear the Argive voices calling retreat, enough to understand through the fog of blood loss and shock that something was wrong. Othryades began to move, and the process was agonizingly slow. He could not stand. His left leg would not support weight, and his right arm had lost the strength to push himself upright. He could only crawl, dragging himself through the carpet of corpses, leaving a trail of blood and viscera that marked his passage like the slime trail of a dying snail. The field, which had seemed small at dawn, now seemed infinite. Every foot of progress required effort that should have been impossible, demanded from a body that had nothing left to give. But Spartan training did not ask bodies what they had left to give. Spartan training simply commanded, and bodies obeyed or died in the attempt. He reached the edge of the corpse pile as the sun touched the western mountains. The light was golden now, the color of wheat in summer, and it illuminated a scene of biblical devastation. The field was no longer recognizable as a field. It was a carpet of bodies, some still moving, most absolutely still, extending from boundary stone to boundary stone. The wheat stubble had vanished beneath the weight of the dead, pressed into mud made of soil and blood and the leaking contents of 500 opened bodies. In the distance, perhaps 200 yards away, Athreides could see figures moving toward the northern boundary. Argives, survivors, running, not running toward the Spartan position, running away from it, running toward the boundary stones, running off the field. Understanding came slowly, filtered through the fog of his injuries. The Argives thought the battle was over. The Argives thought they had won. The Argives were leaving to claim victory while Spartans still lived, while a Spartan still lived. Athreides looked across the corpse-strewn field. He looked for his comrades, for any flash of red cloak that might indicate another survivor. He saw nothing. Only the dead, only the silence that follows slaughter. He was alone. He was the last Spartan on the field, and the Argives were leaving. A Spartan who had not been conditioned since age 7 might have accepted this outcome. The battle was lost. The survivors were too far away to catch. The honorable course was to die quietly, to let the Argives have their technical victory, to acknowledge that Sparta had been beaten by legal cleverness, if not by martial skill. Athreides did not think about honor. He did not think about victory or defeat. He thought about duty, and duty was clear. A Spartan does not abandon the field while enemies remain. A Spartan does not accept defeat while breath remains. A Spartan completes his mission or dies completing it, and the mission was simple: claim this ground for Sparta. He began to crawl. The human body, when pushed beyond its limits, enters a state that modern medicine calls compensatory shock. The blood vessels constrict, redirecting remaining blood flow to critical organs. The heart rate increases, pushing whatever blood remains through a system designed for much higher volumes. The brain, starved of oxygen, begins to shut down non-essential functions, preserving consciousness at the cost of peripheral awareness. Athreides was deep in compensatory shock. His vision had narrowed to a tunnel roughly 2 feet wide. His hearing had faded to a distant ringing punctuated by his own heartbeat. His extremities, hands, feet, the damaged leg, had lost sensation entirely, becoming abstract appendages that he moved through force of will rather than physical feedback. He should not have been able to crawl. The physiological requirements for crawling, coordinated muscle contractions, balance maintenance, spatial awareness, exceeded what his damaged systems could provide, and yet he crawled. The Spartans had a word for this: andreia. It is usually translated as courage, but this translation loses something essential. Andreia was not the absence of fear. It was not bravery in the face of danger. It was the quality that made a man continue functioning when every rational calculation indicated that functioning was impossible. The Agoge did not teach Andreia. The Agoge assumed Andreia and built upon it, but the quality itself was something deeper, something that existed in certain men regardless of training. The Spartans selected for it. They tested for it. They bred for it over generations, creating a population in which the refusal to quit was not a choice but an instinct. Athreides had never quit anything in his life. He had endured the starvation of the Agoge. He had survived the floggings at Artemis Orthia. He had marched for 3 days without sleep during the Arcadian campaign, then fought a battle, then marched 3 more days to return home. His body had learned over decades that its limits were suggestions rather than boundaries. Now those limits were being tested beyond anything he had previously experienced. The crawl across the field took approximately 45 minutes. The distance was perhaps 150 yards from the edge of the corpse pile where he had awakened to the center of the field where the trophy would need to stand. 150 yards through mud and blood and the broken remnants of 600 men's equipment, dragging wounds that should have killed him and would kill him before sunrise. He did not think about the pain. Pain was information, nothing more. Data indicating damage, which his body already knew about and could do nothing to repair. He thought about the trophy, Greek military tradition held that a battle was not truly won until the victors erected a trophy on the field. The trophy was constructed from captured enemy armor, helmets, shields, cuirasses, arranged on a wooden frame to create a mannequin of the defeated force. The trophy marked the spot where the enemy's line had broken. It claimed the ground for the victors. Without a trophy, a battle remained indeterminate, its outcome subject to interpretation and dispute. Athriades understood this tradition at a level deeper than thought. He understood that if he could reach the center of the field, if he could construct a trophy from Argive dead, the legal ambiguity the Argives were exploiting would collapse. The trophy would proclaim Spartan victory regardless of how many Argives had technically survived. The ground would be claimed, the contract would be fulfilled. He began gathering armor from the corpses around him. The work was almost impossible. His right arm could barely grip, and his left arm had to support most of his weight while he crawled. He could collect only the pieces that lay within arm's reach. A helmet here, a greave there, fragments of a shattered shield. He dragged them with him as he moved, creating a small pile of bronze and leather that grew by inches as he progressed. The sun continued to set. The golden light turned orange, then red, then the deep purple of approaching night. The Argive survivors had long since vanished beyond the northern boundary, presumably running to claim their victory. The Spartan main army, 10 miles to the south, would not approach until full darkness. Athriades was alone with the dead. He reached the center of the field as the first stars appeared. The depression he had noticed at dawn, the spot where rainwater collected, had become a shallow pool of blood and other fluids, the drainage point for a field that had absorbed 600 men's worth of mortality. Athriades positioned himself at the edge of this pool and began to build. The trophy took shape slowly. A helmet mounted on a broken spear shaft, tilted at the angle of a defeated warrior, greaves lashed together to form legs, a cuirass propped against the whole structure to give it mass and weight. It was crude, nothing like the elaborate trophies that professional victors constructed after major battles, but it was recognizable. It proclaimed what it was meant to proclaim. The Argives lost. Sparta won. This ground belongs to us. But the trophy needed one final element. A trophy without an inscription was incomplete. It needed words to identify the victors, to ensure that future generations understood what had happened here. Athriades had no stylus. He had no tablet. His equipment had been stripped away during the battle, lost somewhere in the chaos of the corpse pile. He had only his body, his armor, and the blood that continued to flow from his wounds. He understood what he had to do. He dipped his finger into the wound on his abdomen, the 7th wound, the broken spear shaft, and collected the blood that welled there. Then, with a hand that trembled from exhaustion and blood loss, he began to write on his shield. The letters were crude, barely legible, the work of a man operating at the absolute edge of human capability. But they were letters, and they spelled words, and the words would change history. Sparta claims this ground. He completed the inscription as the last light faded from the sky. Then he positioned his shield at the base of the trophy, lay down beside it, and waited for death. The Spartan main army arrived at the battlefield 3 hours after sunset. They came with torches, thousands of them, creating a river of fire that flowed down from the southern hills and pooled at the boundary stones. The ephors had ordered a cautious approach. They did not know what they would find, did not know whether Sparta had won or lost, and they needed to see before they could decide how to respond. What they saw stopped them in their tracks. The field was a slaughterhouse. Even in the dim torchlight, the scale of the carnage was overwhelming. Bodies piled 3 deep in places, equipment scattered across every visible surface, the smell of blood and death so thick it seemed to have physical weight. The ephors had seen battlefields before. They had never seen anything like this. "Find survivors," Kilon ordered. His voice was steady, but his face was pale. "Count the dead. Determine who won." The search parties spread across the field with their torches, stepping carefully between corpses, checking for breath and pulse among the fallen. They found Spartans and Argives intermingled, locked together in death, their wounds telling the story of a battle that had allowed no quarter. They found no survivors, not among the Spartans, not among the Argives. Every man who had entered the field that morning appeared to have left it as a corpse. And then one of the search parties reached the center of the field. "Ephor, here!" Kilon pushed through the mass of bodies, following the shouting voice. What he found stopped him as completely as the initial sight of the battlefield had. The trophy stood at the center of a depression filled with congealed blood. It was crude, barely holding together, but it was unmistakably a trophy, the traditional marker of Greek victory, constructed according to forms that every soldier recognized. At its base lay a single Spartan shield, and on that shield, written in what was obviously dried blood, were 4 words: Sparta claims this ground. Beside the shield lay Othryades. He was not breathing. His wounds were catastrophic, 7 distinct penetrations, any one of which should have killed him, combined with blood loss that had turned his skin the color of old marble. His right hand was still extended toward the shield, as if he had died in the act of completing his final message. Chilon stood over the body for a long moment, reading the inscription again and again. Then he looked up at the trophy, at the Argive armor arranged in the posture of defeat, at the single Spartan who had refused to die until his duty was complete. "We won," he said. The words carried across the silent field. Spartan soldiers searching among the dead stopped and listened. They looked toward the center, toward the torchlight illuminating the trophy and the body beside it. "We won," Chilon repeated, louder now. "Othryades held the field. Othryades built the trophy. Sparta claims this ground." A sound began, not cheering exactly, but something deeper. A rumble of voices, thousands of throats producing a tone that was part grief and part triumph, and part something that had no name. The Spartans had lost 300 men. They had gained Thyreatis forever, or so they believed. The Argive army arrived an hour later, their torches approaching from the north in a formation that suggested aggression rather than observation. They had received word from Alcinor and Chromios, the 2 surviving Argive champions, that Argos had won the battle. Now they were coming to claim their prize. The 2 armies met at the northern boundary stones, separated by perhaps 50 yards of corpse-strewn ground. The Argive commander, a man named Paralaus, rode forward to address the Spartans. "We claim this field," he announced. "Our champions survived. Your champions did not. Thyreatis belongs to Argos." Chilon stepped forward to meet him. In his hands he carried Othryades' shield. "Your champions fled the field before the battle was decided. Our champion remained until death. He built a trophy from your dead. He inscribed this claim in his own blood." Chilon held up the shield, turning it so the torchlight illuminated the crude letters. "Thyreatis belongs to Sparta. That man died alone on an empty field. There was no one to witness his supposed victory. The battle was over when our men withdrew. The battle was not over. If the battle were over, why did he need to build a trophy? He built it because there was still something to claim. He claimed it. Sparta won." The argument continued for hours. Both sides cited the contract, interpreting its ambiguities to support their positions. The neutral priests were summoned to adjudicate, but they could not agree among themselves. The contract had specified that combat would continue until one side had no champions capable of fighting, but it had not specified what happened if both sides had champions capable of fighting, or if the last champion on one side died after building a victory trophy. By dawn, no resolution had been reached. The Argives refused to accept Spartan sovereignty over Thyreatis. The Spartans refused to accept Argive claims. The battle that was supposed to end 50 years of war had resolved nothing. Paralaus made the final decision. If the contract could not be interpreted, the contract was void. If the contract was void, the dispute remained open. If the dispute remained open, it would be settled the traditional way. "We will return with our army," he told Chilon. "We will take Thyreatis by force, as we should have done from the beginning." Chilon nodded slowly. He was not surprised. He had known from this moment he saw the ambiguity in the contract that this outcome was possible. The Spartans had been prepared for it. "Then come," he said. "Bring your army. We will show you what happens when you try to take what Othryades died to claim." The sun rose over a field of corpses and a world that had learned nothing from their deaths. The full-scale battle came 3 days later. Both armies had been positioned within 10 miles of the champion's field, theoretically observing the contract's requirement for non-interference, but practically ready for the possibility that the contract would fail. When it became clear that neither side would accept the other's interpretation of the outcome, the commanders on both sides gave orders that had been prepared in advance. The Battle of Thyreatis, not the champion's duel, but the conventional engagement that followed, lasted approximately 6 hours and resulted in a decisive Spartan victory. The Argive army, demoralized by the loss of 300 of its best men and confused by the disputed outcome of the champion's fight, broke on the Spartan phalanx and was driven from the field with heavy casualties. The Argives lost approximately 4,000 men killed and wounded. The Spartans lost perhaps 800. Thyriatis became Spartan territory for the next 2 centuries. But the numbers tell only part of the story. The real legacy of the Battle of the Champions was not territorial, it was psychological. The Argives never forgave themselves for leaving the field. Alcinor and Chromios, the two survivors who had reported victory to the Argive army, became objects of contempt rather than celebration. They had survived when honor demanded death. They had abandoned the field when duty demanded they hold it. They had given Othryades the time he needed to build his trophy and write his inscription. Both men were effectively exiled from Argive society. Alcinor lived another 20 years, but he lived them as a ghost, never holding public office, never commanding troops, never mentioned in official records. Chromios took his own life within a year of the battle, unable to bear the weight of a shame that would not diminish. The Spartans, meanwhile, built their own mythology around Othryades. He became the exemplar of Spartan virtue, the man who refused to die until his duty was complete, who crawled across a field of corpses to claim victory with his own blood, who proved that Spartan will could overcome any physical limitation. His shield, with its blood-written inscription, was preserved in the temple of Athena at Sparta, displayed for centuries as proof of what Spartans were capable of. But the mythology obscured an uncomfortable truth. Othryades did not save Sparta, he saved a legal argument. The real victory at Thyriatis came from the conventional battle that followed, fought by soldiers who had not been mutilated in the champions' duel, won by numbers and logistics and the same Spartan discipline that had always won Spartan battles. The 300 Spartans who died in the champions' fight accomplished nothing except their own deaths. They proved that Sparta could produce men willing to fight to the last in a confined space against equal numbers, a fact that no one had doubted. They did not prevent the larger war that both sides had supposedly agreed to avoid. They did not create a permanent resolution to the Thyriatis dispute. They did not change the fundamental dynamics of Spartan-Argive relations. They died, and then more men died in the conventional battle that followed, and the total death count exceeded what a normal campaign season might have produced. The clever contract that was supposed to limit bloodshed had instead multiplied it. This is the lesson that history draws from the Battle of the Champions. Though it rarely states it directly, there are no shortcuts in war. You cannot outsource conflict to proxies and expect the conflict to end. You cannot write contracts that bind nations to accept outcomes they find intolerable. You cannot substitute symbolic violence for actual victory. The Spartans and Argives had tried to find an elegant solution to an ugly problem, and the solution had proven uglier than the problem itself. 600 men died for nothing, then 4,000 more died for the same nothing. Then, over the following centuries, thousands more would die in subsequent Spartan-Argive conflicts, each side remembering the Battle of the Champions as either a victory betrayed or a defeat avenged. Othryades became a legend, the battle became a footnote, the land became Spartan, then Argive, then Spartan again, then absorbed into larger empires that rendered the entire dispute meaningless. And somewhere in the archives of Olympia and Delphi, the original contract sat in its bronze case, a document that had promised peace and delivered only more efficient methods of killing. This is why we remember the contract, not because it worked, but because it failed so spectacularly. The blood contract of Thyria stands as proof that human beings, even when they recognize the futility of war, cannot escape the logic that makes war inevitable. We sign our agreements, we make our sacrifices, we build our trophies from the bodies of the dead. And then we fight again, because the bodies were never enough. They are never enough. The 600 men who died at Thyria died believing their deaths would mean something. They died believing that their sacrifice would purchase peace, that their children would inherit a world where the Thyriatis question had been settled forever. Their children inherited a world of war. Their grandchildren inherited the same. The question was settled only when both Sparta and Argos became irrelevant, absorbed into empires that cared nothing for their ancient hatreds. Othryades crawled across a field of corpses to write 4 words in his own blood. The words claimed ground for Sparta. The ground was claimed. The war continued. It always continues.